From the Persian Gulf to the Amazon Basin, two regions thousands of miles apart are confronting the same dilemma: how to survive in a world where power, profit and principle rarely align. The Gulf, Qatar, is doubling down on its alliance with Washington after enduring consecutive strikes from Israel and Iran. Once hailed as the region's ultimate mediator, Doha now finds its soft power diplomacy tested by the very powers it tried to balance. Can it still count on the United States as a shield, or has loyalty become a liability? Across the Atlantic, Latin America's energy giants are caught in their own moral gridlock. Brazil expands drilling near the Amazon while preaching climate leadership, and Colombia sacrifices growth for a fossil-free vision the world applauds but won't finance. Both paths expose a deeper truth: the global energy transition is not a shared march towards sustainability. It's a contest of survival shaped by inequality, dependence, and political will. Tonight we ask, how do small states and emerging economies navigate superpower pressure without losing sovereignty, stability, or survival? I'm Hani Saif. Let's get in focus. According to Foreign Policy, the recent Israeli strike on Qatar was not just another flashpoint in the region. It was a stress test for Doha's entire security architecture. For decades, Qatar's defense strategy has rested on two pillars: the US umbrella, anchored at Al Udeid Air Base, and Turkish deterrence against regional rivals. Yet after successive attacks from Israel and Iran, cracks are beginning to show. Doha's answer, surprisingly, isn't diversification, but deeper alignment. While Riyadh courts Beijing and Islamabad, Qatar is doubling down on Washington and select NATO allies, particularly the UK and France. The strategy is clear: preserve trust in Washington, even as Trump's foreign policy grows more unpredictable. With diplomacy stretched from Gaza to Venezuela, Doha is betting that soft power and mediation remain its most valuable defense. But can a small Gulf nation continue balancing between deterrence and dependence? To unpack Qatar's evolving strategy and Washington's shifting calculus, we're joined by Ms. Ginger Chapman, the political analyst and lawyer from Washington, D.C., specializing in U.S. foreign policy and Middle East diplomacy. Ms. Chapman, thank you very much for joining us. Israel's strike on Qatar marked a dramatic escalation. What does this event reveal about the limits of Qatar's security model?
Well, first, Mr. Haney, thank you for having me today, and greetings to your viewers. And one thing that's important to remember is Qatar was not bombed once, but Qatar was actually bombed twice. First, they were bombed by Israel in order to block ongoing negotiations with Hamas. And then second, they were bombed by Iran. So Qatar, as part of its role as an international mediator, it's assuming a larger role in international relations. It's becoming solidified as a peacemaker. However, the risks for Qatar, as we've seen, are immense. And right now, Qatar is a hot spot. America's largest base in the Middle East is in Doha. And Qatar now has to walk or navigate a very fine line between political, diplomatic, economic, and military relationships in a rapidly changing landscape. One of the first things we saw after the bombing in Qatar was Saudi Arabia and Pakistan entered into a security agreement because it became apparent that the United States could not or may not be able to protect our Gulf Arab partners from Israel. And this is further complicated by the role of China. China is actively pursuing its Belt and Road initiatives in the Middle East. It's developing trade corridors and railroads for commerce. So China is assuming an increasing role and would very much like to have closer ties with Qatar, as well as closer ties with Pakistan. However, Washington is an obstacle to this because Washington would like to keep China at arm's length away from our ally Qatar and our growing relationships with Pakistan over mineral deals. So Washington is also navigating and trying to gain opportunities for America, our mineral deals, our energy requirements, the flow of oil and gas. All of this is complicating relationships. First of all, economics is the most important, and then militarily. And we see that Qatar is caught in a unique position. They are in a geopolitical hinge area where many countries' interests, economic, military, and diplomatic interests, are coming together and centering on Qatar.
Well, Ms. Chapman, you've explained why maybe Washington would want to have stronger relations with Qatar, but despite the shocks you've already mentioned, Doha seems to be reaffirming its trust in Washington. So why is Qatar choosing deeper dependence instead of diversification?
Well, it appears that Washington is also seeking diversification, and Qatar appears to be seeking diversification, however, in a very diplomatic, nuanced way that does not threaten Washington, does not threaten America's concern over China as a rising power. So Doha, once again, Prime Minister Abdul Rahman, he has to walk a very fine line. He has very long-standing business and personal relationships with many high officials in Washington. Steve Witkoff. Trump has frequently spoken of his long-standing business relationships with Doha. So Doha is uniquely positioned, and it appears that as Washington, D.C. is also trying to diversify, Washington, D.C. is reaching out to Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam for mineral and economic relationships. And Doha, in a way, is going to play a large role in that. We see that Doha and Turkey are strengthening their relations, which in a way can also help the United States strengthen their relations with Turkey, because right now Trump knows he needs Turkey's help with the situation in Palestine. However, Israel objects to Turkey. At the same time, so this is a very it's very dynamic, and the cross relationships are confusing. And
yes, well, Ms. Chapman, before we move on, you mentioned that Qatar is repositioning itself as an indispensable mediator. Now, how sustainable then is this personalized diplomacy model?
This is very sustainable. In fact, we say in America that Qatar is becoming the Switzerland of the Middle East. They have the means and the infrastructure to be well insulated from economic pressures, at the same time that they have good diplomatic relations with a variety of players that would be on opposing sides. So, for example, they are able to have negotiations with Saudi Arabia, with Pakistan, with China, and the United States is actually going to rely on Qatar more as Qatar develops relationships with nations that the United States does not have good relations. So instead of Qatar being shut out by increasing diplomatic relations with Pakistan and China, ultimately the United States will come to rely on Doha more because they will have developing positive relations with countries that the United States will need to engage with. So even right now, as there are trade disputes between China, between Beijing and Washington, in the future, Qatar could also pave the way and negotiate better relations with
Yes.
China and Washington.
You mentioned Turkey. Now, Turkey remains a crucial partner in Doha's defense calculus. Yet, given Ankara's strained ties with Israel, is Turkey now an asset or a liability for Qatari security?
Turkey is going to be an asset, and this is not just because of their growing role in the Middle East, but also because they are a NATO country. So they have one foot in Europe, one foot in the Middle East, and this is going to enable them to perhaps bridge some of the gaps between what the United Nations objectives are in Palestine and the Middle East, and the resistance from Israel, and even their tenuous but increasingly positive relations with nations such as Qatar and perhaps eventually other Gulf states. And we do see President Erdogan is attaining a larger role, not just, for example, in negotiations between Ukraine and Russia and between NATO and Russia, but Turkey is also stepping up as far as having a louder voice in the international stabilization force that should be deployed in Palestine. Turkey is, or President Erdogan is making offers of assistance that is going to be very difficult for Washington to say no to, even in the face of Israeli resistance, as Turkey looks like a more responsible and a more engaged and a more diplomatic partner that will help President Trump in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, President Trump's strategy in the Middle East is chaotic. He's very reactive to changing events, and President Trump does not have the political will to say no to Netanyahu. So Trump is increasingly relying on other nations to create an architecture or an infrastructure to help contain Israel's aggression in areas that the United States cannot say no. And a significant part of this is going to be the civilian military complex, the base that the United States has already established in Israel. President Trump announced yesterday the plans for a $500 billion new military base in Gaza. This is very confusing to the American people because J.D. Vance said American boots will not be on the ground. However, this new base is expected to hold up to 10,000 soldiers, not just Americans, but international soldiers. And Turkey is going to play a very large part in that. And Doha is going to have to be the country that is Trump's ambassador and helps Trump negotiate through these thorny issues that are essentially caused by the logjam that's happening now in Israel, in Palestine.
Talking about Qatar's partners, how do Qatar's overtures to the UK and France fit into this long-term security framework? Are these partnerships symbolic, or do they actually offer real protection?
Well, so far these partnerships have been viewed as symbolic. However, as the European Union, especially the E3, France, UK, and Germany, as they're becoming politically weaker at home because of their ongoing involvement in the Ukraine war, their populations are increasingly angry with them. Their economies are increasingly fragile as they're giving up cheap Russian energy. So the EU nations are going to actually rely more on Qatar, Doha's negotiations, and on the Middle East itself as another as a replacement for their energy needs, and also because as they're diplomatically losing ground on the international stage, their losses in Ukraine, they are going to have to pivot more to the Middle East, and Doha, their relationship with Qatar, is going to help the European Union perhaps far more than the European Union and the E3 will
Yes.
help Doha. But this will lead to Doha's increasingly positive reputation and the reliance
Yes.
of the E3 countries as well.
One final question, Ms. Chapman. Washington's pressure on Gulf states regarding China is intensifying. So how does Qatar balance its economic ties with Beijing while avoiding strategic friction with the U.S.?
Yes, and this is exactly the needle that Doha must thread. There is increasing involvement with China amongst all nations because of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and more countries are engaging in positive economic relations with China, even in defiance against America. We see this happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So as the United States increasingly relies on our international partners, as the world becomes more multipolar and the United States has to accept living in a multipolar world, Doha will have less resistance from Washington in their relations with China, especially as their economic as opposed to military relations. And Doha will wind up becoming a bridge between China and the United States relation-wise, even though initially Doha is going to have to tread lightly and thread the needle in their initial relations with China. But ultimately, as Doha-Beijing relations improve, then Washington will benefit by having Doha assist Washington with China
Yes.
relations.
Ms. Ginger Chapman, thank you very much for joining us from Washington. Always a pleasure. Qatar's strategy may be clear, but its outcome remains uncertain, anchored to Washington yet surrounded by volatility. Now, from the Gulf's fragile balance of deterrence, we turn to another region wrestling with dependence, this time on oil. Latin America, rich in resources but trapped in contradictions, is trying to reconcile the urgent call for climate action with the realities of economic survival. The divide between Brazil's pragmatism and Colombia's idealism captures a global struggle. Can developing nations afford to go green when the rich world won't? As the Financial Times reports, Latin America's biggest economies face a climate contradiction. Brazil's President Lula da Silva, once celebrated as a global environmental champion, has now greenlit new oil exploration near the Amazon River, just weeks before COP30. His argument, as long as the world needs it, Brazil will not throw away its wealth. Meanwhile, Colombia's President Gustavo Petro has taken the opposite path, halting new oil projects and pledging a fossil-free future. Yet this moral stance has cost Colombia dearly. Shrinking growth, lost revenues, and rising dependence on imports. Across the region, leaders must choose between ecology and economy. But can a just transition truly exist in nations where oil still fuels survival? And we're joined from Buenos Aires by Mr. Tobias Belgrano, the political researcher and Latin American affairs. Mr. Tobias, thank you very much for joining us. Lula's decision to expand oil drilling near the Amazon shocked environmentalists. What does this reveal about Brazil's real priorities ahead of COP30?
Well, Brazil is a particular case in Latin America because it's a strong oil producer in the region and also has a strong industrial apparatus that makes it a difference between the rest of the countries of Latin America. Only can be compared with Argentina. The rest of the countries of Latin America lack of complex industries like Argentina or Brazil. So Brazil is being pragmatic right now because of a current scenario of deindustrialization and aggressive competition in the industrial world, especially among China and Brazil. So Brazil needs to have a cheap energy to keep moving forward and keep moving forward its economy and its industrial apparatus. Regarding the environmental perspective, Brazil. Initially, this was a quarrel that started during Bolsonaro administration, especially criticizing between Bolsonaro and the French President Emmanuel Macron, even having a personal quarrel with Emmanuel Macron's wife. Bolsonaro claimed that Amazon was of the Brazilians, and in an attempted nationalism, he promoted the deforestation and expansion of oil exploitations in the Amazon. Right now, Lula da Silva, because of a current international scenario, it's forced to move forward to pragmatism and started exploiting this kind of
Yes.
energy resources.
Mr. Belgrano, many developing nations argue that wealthy countries caused the crisis and should pay for the transition. Is Latin America's pushback justified then?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Many wealthy nations have caused the crisis. That's what many developing nations are arguing. Should they pay for the transition? Is Latin America's pushback justified?
Well, yes, I do believe it's justified for Latin America to exploit its own natural resources, especially with countries like Argentina or Brazil. We are talking about countries which have 30-40% of the people under the level of poverty, or people which are very marginalized in big cities. You don't need to go to Rio de Janeiro or to Sao Paulo or Buenos Aires to see what's happening over the socially. So yes, I mean I believe it's completely justified for Latin American nations to exploit their oil reserves as much as they desire, because they have a lot of postponed people in their society that need to be incorporated in the working sector and in the formal economy, and are marginalized because of structural poverty in countries like Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and many countries of the region.
Mm-hmm. Colombia's Petro tried to lead by example, stopping new oil exploration. Why has this backfired economically and politically as well?
Well, economically, that will definitely backfire Colombia, which has some level of exploitation in oil. There's a reason of domestic policy regarding why Gustavo Petro is more in favor of reducing the intervention in oil reserves, especially because of the native Colombians that live in the Amazon area. So those are partially the reasons why Gustavo Petro moves forward with a eco attempt to resist this new oil exploitation. However, it's an isolated voice, and from the big economies of the region like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. He's an isolated voice in that chorus. The only voices that are similar to that are Chile and Uruguay, which went increasingly green in their energy resources. However, those are small economies in the region. They are not big tracking economies in the global economy. So doesn't make that much difference rather than Colombia, which is a medium-sized economy in the Latin American context.
Mm-hmm. Well, some argue that Brazil is pursuing a pragmatic green capitalism, investing in biofuels while keeping oil revenues as well. Can this dual path work?
Well, it's still to see. I do think also that there's an issue upcoming for the oil industry, especially due to the electric cars that are getting increasingly popular in the region and in countries like Argentina or Brazil. the expansion of the new technology, especially Chinese technology, are causing a lot of struggle for automotive companies, and also will generate struggle with the oil industry in the medium term. Despite countries like Argentina or Bolivia or Chile have a strong lithium reserves that allow them to be part of this new sector, we're going to probably see a change in the energy perspective of the countries of the region.
Mm-hmm. Across Latin America, from Argentina's shale fields to Suriname's new offshore wells, how is the region reconciling the economic need with environmental pledges?
So generally right now, as I was mentioning, the current scenario is that countries are exploiting the resources without any ecological guilt, to say it in that way, to phrase it like that. Particularly Argentina with the Vaca Muerta exploitation in the south of the country, and also countries like Brazil that are starting to move forward also in that approach. We have also to read that situation and this new growth of expansion not only because of the increasing competition for the Brazilian economy and the Brazilian industrial apparatus. There's also another lecture to see why Brazil is doing this right now. We have also to tie it politically. Why does Brazil does this after meeting what Lula does this after meeting President Trump in the UN, and then after they have their own bilateral meeting. So I think that there's also a political perspective that the U.S. might be interested also in Brazil expanding its oil industry and its oil resources. Mm-hmm. And that's a stance also against the European perspective. Emmanuel Macron, which was very in favor of preserving the Amazon against the expansion of oil exploitation and deforestation.
Yes, well, could the backlash against Petro's policies, for instance, signal a regional retreat from the climate ambition? I mean, how might Latin America's energy politics then influence global negotiations at the upcoming COP30 in Belém?
Well, it's going to have a key influence. I think that the Gustavo Petro's intention of moving forward in a greener economies in a country of the size of Colombia and its economy of the size of Colombia is not that accurate because it's a big economy, and the current scenario of the region is not of eco policies rather than more expansion and exploitation of natural resources. So if Colombia is left behind, probably will have an impact in their own economy. And regarding the negotiation, if Latin America opens up for business to exploit their natural resources, we are seeing in mining in Peru, in Argentina, and in Brazil with oil exploitation, probably this will have an impact in the supply chains, in the global supply chains, and this impact in the global supply chains will cause tension in the current trade war between China and the US, which is generating a lot of tensions internally, especially politically, because of this commercial race that it's happening since Mr. Trump arrived again to the White House.
From Buenos Aires, Mr. Tobias Belgrano, thank you very much for your insights. Latin America's paradox is clear. The region wants to lead the green transition, but not at the expense of growth. From Doha's diplomatic juggling to Latin America's climate crossroads, today's stories remind us that power often lies not in size or wealth, but in timing, trust, and trade-offs. I'm Henny Seif. This was In Focus.